Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 8, Section 2, The Crisis Deepens. So make sure you have your handout ready. Here we go. The picture that you see here, this painting, is a painting by a man named John Stuart Curie. It's called The Tragic Prelude. And the man who's at the center of this painting is no other than John Brown. And if you take a look, John Brown has really kind of taken the center of attention here. In one of his hands, he has his rifle. In the other hand, he has the Bible. You can kind of see the Alpha and Omega that are kind of written on the pages there. In the background, you might see the tornado. And then perhaps maybe on the right side, you might see fire that's kind of brewing on the plains. You might also see the Conestoga wagons with the oxen that are being pulled. But in the middle of that, you might see the United States flag and the Confederate flag. And on the ground towards the front, two soldiers that are lying there dead. One wearing the blue and one perhaps maybe wearing what they call the butternut or the gray, if you want to call it that, probably representing soldiers from both the North and the South. One of our soldiers in kind of in the photograph here or the painting is an African-American man. The key here is, where in the world would you find this painting? And the painting itself is kind of controversial if you kind of look at all the symbolism and really kind of look deeper into some of the other things that are happening here. You see images of African Americans kind of hidden into the imagery here. But this painting is actually a mural, and the mural is located at the state capitol building in the state of Kansas, in the city of Topeka. And what's interesting is, in this day and age that we live, with all the concern about political correctness, the fact that you see a Confederate flag in the background, this is one of those items that is kind of scandalous, in a sense. Matter of fact, when the painting had been commissioned back in the 1930s and went up in the Capitol building there in Topeka, there was public outcry. The fact that many people in Kansas didn't want John Brown necessarily representing them and their state because of all the tragedy and the bloodshed that happened during the years of Bleeding Kansas. But it is an interesting portrait. Certainly it's controversial, maybe even thought-provoking, but pay attention so you know where you might find this in the future if I would happen to ask. So we're going to start with our notes, and we're going to kind of jump around a little bit here so you can kind of see that our numberings or letterings here are a little different here. So follow along carefully. The birth of the Republican Party. Letter A, pro-slavery and anti-slavery Whigs. Whigs were a political party in the 1850s. They had long battled for control of the party, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act eventually split up the party. And what we have are those people who were what I would call the anti-slavery Whigs kind of going off into a different direction. And eventually, some of these individuals are going to start thinking about maybe forming a new political party. And so letter B, the anti-slavery coalition formed during the congressional elections of 1854, that would be about the time of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, took many different names, but the most popular of these was the Republican Party. And here's your little, your tidbit of the day. Maybe we can see if you're paying attention here to your notes. But the GOP represents or stands for the Grand Old Party, which is kind of ironic because the Democratic Party is actually older than the Republican Party. So, letter E, James Buchanan, who is the man that you see kind of off to the bottom and the right, is going to run for president in 1856. And actually, he runs as a Democrat. The Republican candidate that year was John C. Fremont. And this is the first time that the Republicans are ever going to run a candidate. But Buchanan suggested that the nation let the Supreme Court decide the question of slavery in the territories. And as a result of that, we're going to have some public outcry, particularly when we talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and what eventually is going to lead into discussion about the Dred Scott case. But if you take a look at this political cartoon, we've got what looks like a man here who is getting maybe his tooth pulled or something. Murder, help, neighbors, help. Oh, my poor wife and children. This whole idea of the concept of forcing slavery down the throat of the free soiler. And a free soiler are those people who maybe were moving to places like Kansas or Nebraska hoping that there would be no slavery whatsoever. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or particularly what was happening in Kansas, was forcing slavery to take place. The men that you see kind of holding down our central character here are actually politicians of the era of time, men who were members of Congress. And so in a sense, this was a slap in their face. Roman numeral 2, the emergence of Abraham Lincoln. By 1858, Stephen Douglas, that you see down here at the bottom right-hand corner, had taken positions on the Kansas situation, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Dred Scott case that made him less popular in both the North and the South. Douglas was from the state of Illinois. He was a Democrat from Chicago, an attorney. Matter of fact, he was one of the guys who was a proponent for putting the Transcontinental Railroad through the Platte River Valley. And part of that was the fact that the city of Chicago would profit from that. And if you think about it, the interstate, which follows kind of the Transcontinental Railroad, kind of goes right to Chicago. So yeah, this guy, he's made a name for himself politically. He is going to be challenged by kind of this, not necessarily unknown, but kind of a oddball, if you want to call him that, because of his looks and maybe some of his positions on some issues. But in 1858, Illinois Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln to run for the U.S. Senate against Douglas. Douglas was an incumbent. He had held the seat, and Abe Lincoln had served in the House of Representatives for one term, which basically means 2 years, and was sent home. He practiced law. Matter of fact, he was an apprenticed lawyer, meaning that he never went to law school, but he worked for a lawyer and learned, kind of the art of law, and eventually became a lawyer. Tall man for his age, in that era of time, I guess if you want to call it the age, stood well over 6 foot tall, kind of a skinny fella. And if you compare him to Douglas was about maybe 5'2", 5'3", possibly 5'4", kind of a rounded kind of guy. These guys were really two men who were polar opposites, especially on some of the issues. These two guys got together and they had a series of debates around the state of Illinois. And it's during those debates that Abraham Lincoln is challenging Douglas, particularly on the issue of slavery. And you might hear a little bit about one of those lines, like a house divided against itself will never stand. And in a way, that's Lincoln talking about our government, the fact that if we're divided over this issue of slavery, we're not going to be able to maintain ourselves. We're not going to be able to stand up. And needless to say, Lincoln loses the election, but he makes a name for himself. And that's going to be very helpful in 1860 when the election rolls around and Abraham Lincoln is going to eventually run for president as a Republican. Letter C, although not an abolitionist, Lincoln believed that slavery was morally wrong, and certainly spoke out against the Dred Scott decision. As you can see here, Justice Taney and Dred Scott. John Brown's raid. After all the bloodshed that happened in Kansas, Brown had to get out of there because he was a wanted man, wanted for murder because he had really kind of called for this insurrection that was happening in the state of Kansas. And he went through some free areas. Matter of fact, if you know anything about Brown and how he relates back to our state of Nebraska, you go down by Nebraska City and you might hear of a place called John Brown's Cave. Well, it really isn't a cave, but along the Missouri River, if you go back to about the 1850s, the Missouri River was not put into channels, meaning that there were no levees keeping the river in its place, and the river would change course. And every so often, when the river would change courses, it would kind of erode the soil, and eventually, what would be left as the river moved to a new channel are like some caves. And some of these are caves that for years stood. Um, so, needless to say, there were places there along the Underground Railroad that dipped into Kansas and went through parts of Nebraska and Iowa and eventually throughout the North, where runaway slaves were hidden. And hence, that's kind of where that name comes from. But Brown got out of Kansas and eventually um, started to kind of raise a little heck elsewhere. So, in letter A, John Brown, a fervent abolitionist, developed a plan to seize the federal arsenal at a place called Harper's Ferry, Virginia. I've been here, and there is a picture here of this federal arsenal. It is not very big. Might be just a hair bigger than our classroom here. But the federal government stored a lot of its rifles, some of its smaller cannons in these different federal arsenals that were kind of scattered throughout the United States at that period of time. And what Brown and some of his followers, some of them including freed slaves, and what he was hoping for were maybe some people who were enslaved, if they'd gotten the word, would basically run away from their masters and meet at Harper's Ferry and arm themselves and prepare for basically the Armageddon. So Brown and his followers, they seized control of this arsenal, and eventually the federal government calls in the Marines. And the Marines are kind of under the command of a man who is not a Marine. Lee, just so you know, is a U.S. Army colonel, so it's kind of unusual that a U.S. Army colonel is leading a bunch of Marines. Traveled to Harper's Ferry, which is probably today maybe a little over an hour and a half from Washington, D.C., and capture Brown just 36 hours after his rebellion began. Brown is arrested and jailed and charged with murder. Many Northerners view Brown as a martyr in the noble cause. Within a short period of time, he is tried, found guilty, and is hanged. And as a result, John Brown becomes kind of the patron of the anti-slavery cause in our nation and is seen as a hero among the abolitionists. So, thank you very much.